Why are we talking about storytelling at CES? If you look at the connection between storytelling and technology, they're very closely linked, right? From the printing press, obviously to radio, the silver screen, TV, and the internet. With the explosion of technology and digital, our storytelling has really expanded exponentially. The platforms that we're on, the way that we tell stories, the audiences we tell stories to. And so, as we look at the future and at this explosion of technology, we need to consider how we tell stories. Storytelling is actually the fuel of a lot of these, and frankly, most technology, but especially communication technology. If it doesn't actually fuel storytelling, and if storytelling doesn't actually fuel that platform, it doesn't exist. So storytelling is instrumental in terms of the success of platforms. So what is storytelling to you? And we'll start with you, Ryan. What does that mean?
Yeah, I think to me, storytelling is just about extracting the authentic truth out of a situation, right? Or out of a specific person. That's what storytelling is, and I think the levels of how you rate storytelling is understanding how good you were at extracting that truth, right? And I think that truth is very specific to that individual or to that situation. However, the better you are at storytelling, you can extract that truth so that everyone can see themselves in that person or in that situation.
It should compel a human to feel something and make a human connection, and ultimately it should compel a human to do something.
In some ways, just differentiate it from just information.
Exactly.
Right? And so, and you speak, both of you, to kind of the human element or something that's revealed. Evan?
Yeah, I think that storytelling is meant in its heart to be a reflection of society and a culture that it's being born into, and that storytellers or creators, their responsibility is hold a mirror up to society in some form or fashion and ask the culture to look at itself, to look inward, to look outward. And so I see it as almost creating a mirror for the people who read, watch, hear the story itself.
I think of storytelling as a way to relate and make a connection.
All of us have been doing a version of storytelling for a while. When you started your career, things looked a little bit different than they do today. So can you just speak to that a little bit, and why don't we start with you, Evan, in terms of how have things changed and how has that changed your thinking?
To me, the ability to start a story in one media and then move it to others. I mean, we've been doing that forever. Books turn into movies, movies turn into musicals, musicals turn back into movies, Matilda. That. So to me, the technology we've added to storytelling, I don't think it's necessarily changed the nature of telling stories itself, meaning like there's a beginning, character still matters, plot still matters.
Right. Well, and you talked about adaptation a little bit, which is interesting in that a book to film or TV is a process we all understand. When you're talking about content and the idea of multiple platforms and taking something from one platform to another, can we talk a little bit about adaptation? Ryan, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of, and I think it's still in relation to kind of learnings, the beginning of your career and where it's evolved, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I started off as a journalist, as a hip-hop journalist that wrote for something storied that we call magazines, right? Like, we don't know what those are.
What was that called again? What was
exactly.
It? Magazine?
Magazines,
Remember
yes.
print?
They used to be sold on newsstands. I worked for paper, made of trees. I worked for the Source magazine, right? So as a hip-hop journalist, and I felt it was my duty as a journalist, as a trained journalist, I went to school for journalism, to tell the story as unbiased as I could, right? And give people that didn't have the opportunity to be in the room with, Puff Daddy or Snoop Dogg or somebody, the idea of what it was like, right? I also felt a responsibility to tell the stories of the communities that they came from in a way that was provided the right respect and had the right value for that, right? And I was good at it, right? I was good at taking this scenario and translating it into words and then putting it on trees and putting it on newsstands, and then people would read it. But then came social media, then came GoPros, then came iPhones and all these other things, and you don't need someone to translate that story in real time. Oftentimes, especially with celebrities and rappers especially, they're telling their own stories on social media, to your point, on different social media in different ways, right? And I don't look at it so much as adaptation. I like that, but I look at it as optimization. Mm-hmm. There's an opportunity here to tell a story differently on Instagram Live than you would on a podcast, than you would on a scripted TV show, right? So I think that the best stories now are the stories that live, like you said, everywhere, right? A bit asymmetrical at times. You could tap into it at this point, and that point, even though it happened later in the timeline, is going to refer you back to this point, right? And that is really how we're judging stories now, right? There's a good book, of course. There's a good magazine article, right? But how does that come alive? And how do people talk about it, right? They might not be adding to the story, but so much of the user-generated content, the comments, are adding to the experience of what that story is.
They can become part of the story.
Exactly.
Janet, what have your experiences been in terms of what have you learned since the beginning of storytelling and where you are now?
Well, I too started in print. So I started at Time Inc. in magazines. And, for me, that adaptation, there's so many different things that it makes me think about. First and foremost, Time Inc. for me was about quality. It's about editorial integrity. And I think that gives you that simple notion that in order for content to connect with humans, it has to have quality. It has to make that human connection. And I think that that's a simple truth that carries forward. But if I think about, at one point I was at Martha Stewart and we were translating magazines and we were actually doing the very first issue for the iPad. And there's a big difference between the bespoke imagery that you would see in a Martha Stewart magazine of a peony on a still page and how you could bring that to life when you could touch the iPad and that peony could animate and actually open. Mm-hmm. And the photography that you could use of all the different moments of that flower going through every one of those moments and suddenly that actually blossoms in front of you, that's a whole different form of storytelling. And so being able to realize that it wasn't simply about paging through the magazine on an iPad, that's a new dimension. And when I think about when I was at Huffington Post, there it was that intersection again. We had lots of journalists coming over from the New York Times or Vanity Fair, again, print as their heritage, quality editorial as their heritage, but there they were really engaging with that notion of content and conversation, how to create velocity around a story and really create that dialogue. I think one of the biggest things, though, that really strikes me is that while the palette has changed and there are these very important distinctions about the creative dimensions you can bring forward in each of the platforms, the way we discover content has changed.
Sure.
Because I think if at the beginning of my career, it was much more top-down. I mean, there were a few media entities that basically programmed, and we kind of all watched the same things from a few different programmers, and we aggregated around the same properties, generally speaking. And so content had to be compelling, but it was kind of programmed to us.
Right.
Now there's a lot more discovery, I think, of the mid and the long tail of content because of first search, then social, now much more dramatic algorithms that let us scroll through things that seem to know what's inside of our brains and our subconscious. I think that's the biggest thing that's really changed in terms of storytelling and what we get to see.
Yep. As we think about audience, as we think about data, and we think about not only the data that's available right now, but also the world that we want to create. Stories in so many ways dictate the structure of how we think about society, how we think about ourselves. How does audience come into play when you think about data specifically and storytelling? And
I would say it's very important, though, with all the data and technology that we can pipe very intelligently, and that almost every CMO that I'm working with is doing an incredible job to really build the right audiences, to really understand the segments of audience that they need to use to drive their business, to drive their growth, and to be profitable. And it is very carefully choreographed at a macro level, at a micro level, strategically, operationally, not only within their companies, but also with their agencies, It is a very careful orchestration, and those that are doing it well are wiring it very, very carefully, both within their own companies and with their partners that they're working with, because it really takes a lot of precision to do it well. That being said, I think it's very important that we not over-obsess with the word audience, because as data and technology have continued to advance, I think we've almost, we get into these hype cycles, and so we'll talk about like one-to-one personalization. I can't tell you, there are very few clients that I see that actually have the right data, the right technology, and the right operating model to actually be able to do one-to-one personalization of data, technology, and creative at scale. It's not a reality. So being able to think about personalized messages, being able to understand cohorts of audience, yes, absolutely. Being able to think very strategically about the audiences that matter and to bring resonating messages to those humans, absolutely. And by the way, I like to use the word humans as opposed to audience, because as soon as you get into consumers and segments, you forget that they are human.
Right.
That they are human.
Right.
I think a more important word is relevance. And I'll use some W's to walk through it. But for me, relevance is a more important concept because, yes, it does have the who. It has audience. But it also has what, which is context. It also has where, which is geographically or spatially where we are. And it also has when, and it also has why. We have to think about, what's the mindset that we're connecting with the human, and can we create relevance? I think that's as important as audience, and I almost feel like we've become over-obsessed with the notion of audience targeting, both for media and creative, and we've lost sight of, and we'll get into all the technical reasons and privacy reasons why it'll get harder or easier over time.
Sure.
But I think it's really important just to focus on relevance.
How do you think about the future and reasonable opportunities?
I think for businesses as they go into it, the thing I do encourage is don't just follow the hype cycle, and just because someone else did it doesn't mean you should go do it.
Sure.
It may not be right for you. You have to figure out your why. Like, why do you need to go do this? Is there an insight about your audience, your consumer, the humans you want to go touch that leads you to believe this is going to be something they're going to connect with? And I think it's really important to do that. Is it important to your talent agenda? Is it important to your innovation agenda? Is it important to your consumers, your future, your business model? If so, then yes, go for it. And then the other thing I think is super important is to just make sure that the technology doesn't lead you there. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. I mean, we've seen this so many times. I mean, frankly, you can go out to the convention center, you can see a lot of really wacky use cases, but why would
Create
you
a
ever
digital
want to
twin
go
that lives after you die. Why?
Like, there's not a why. We as humans don't need to do a lot of it.
Right.
So I think it's really important with the metaverse and Web3 to just make sure that we go back to the fundamentals. This is about storytelling. Will it make a human connection? Will it be more compelling, more immersive? Will that third dimension make it better?
Right.
Will it allow you to engage fans or fellow artists or in a more compelling way? Will allow you to bring people in? Then yes, go for it. If not, it's not the right answer. So
Right.
I just think it's all of the conversation, whether it's about audience or relevance, it's about just being thoughtful and honoring the craft of storytelling, and really just being very bespoke in the decisions and choices that you make. Because if you're deliberate, you can get to the right answer.
And in some ways, it's what is the most basic human utility, right? What is this action? How is this making my life better? And then it seems like that would be a platform or a technology that does make sense to lean into.
And if it's not an intuitive journey, if they're not going to figure it out, they're not going to use it. Nothing's going to scale. I mean, right now, part of the problem with the metaverse is it's obviously not at scale in one place, which is fine, and that's not going to change. But the issue is, will people be able to take the journey and figure it out? If not, it's probably not going to make sense, just like something at a store or something on a website or anything else that we experience today.
Right.